life is constantly throwing challenges at us. It may be a little challenge, like when we walked in this morning, there were donuts out and had to decide whether or not we were going to partake of that. Or they may be large challenges, like a career change or a move, or is it time to downsize our home? There are all kinds of challenges that face us each and every day. When we were in Belize, we learned that the people there face challenge every day. In fact, it's a challenge there just to live. Last week, when we were giving the report back, Jackson Wimpy talked about a sermon I preached in Belize where we looked at God's power and God's perspective and God's presence. And I thought, as Jackson shared that, perhaps we could use that same information here in our church. As we heard this morning, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken off from their native land of Israel, and they were taken off to Babylon, and they were in captivity, and they were facing challenges. Everything was strange. The language was different. The food was different. The culture was different. But mainly, the gods were different. And King Nebuchadnezzar had made a golden idol, and he had ordered everybody that when they made all kinds of racket, they were all to come and to bow down before this idol. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to make a decision. And they refused to worship this false god. Rather, they chose to worship the living God. And so King Nebuchadnezzar brought them before him. And he questioned them and said, "Will you not fall down and worship, or I will kill you in this fiery furnace?" And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king. They said that God has the power to deliver us. One of the things we need to recognize in life is that when we face challenges, God has power. Who is really in charge of this world? We turn on the news and we see all the politics of our day, and everyone is wanting power and control, and they're willing to say anything to get it. But don't be deceived. It is God who is ultimately in power. After the Second World War, the nations who had fought decided to divvy up the spoils. Germany was split in two, and we all know that West Germany fell under the power of Europe and of America. And East Germany fell under the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union decided to build a wall right through Berlin. And it split that town. And everybody said there is great power here, and you had to obey the state or else you would be killed. It was much like the time of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Many tried to get over the wall, and many were killed. There were a group of Christians, however, that decided that God had the ultimate power. So there was a group in Leipzig called the Church Below, because they came for the powerless. And they came together every week, and they began to pray. First, it was only a handful of folks. But as they prayed, week in and week out, year after year, it became thousands praying together. On October 7th, 1989, several thousand people came to that church to pray. And after they prayed, they poured out into the streets. A couple of days later, as they were continuing to pray and as they were continuing to protest, the government had a decision. Would they go against the power of the people and the power of God, while the people proclaimed, "No violence, no violence, do what is right"? And some who had been in the army, who were there to infiltrate the prayer meeting, heard the prayers of the people and decided they would not have violence against these people. You know what happened? The people attacked the wall and they tore it down with their bare hands. You see, we might think that there is power in some places, but God has ultimate power. God's power can be seen through us even when we are weak. In fact, Paul said that God is strongest in us when we are weak, when we get out of God's way and we allow God to use us. Several years ago, I was involved in building a church. It was a mission church, and we asked for volunteers to come and to help us construct that building. Several hundred people showed up, and I thought, how in the world are we going to organize all these people? There was an architect there that had drawn our plans for us, and I talked to him on the phone, but I had never seen him. He showed up. And do y'all remember Dobie Gillis? I know some of y'all are too young for that, but that's what he looked like. He was skinny and small, and he had this little Weasley voice. And I thought, no one's going to listen to this guy. But he called everybody together, and he had us all hold hands. And he prayed for the building. And he prayed for the workers. And when he said amen, he took over. He said, you 12, go over here and do this. You 15, go over here and do this. You go and do that. And everybody listened. And about 100 plus people were organized and began to build a church. I didn't think much about him, but God used him in a mighty way. God can use you that way too. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when we recognize that God's power is greater than any earthly power, and we ask God's power to come upon us, things can change. But it wasn't just the power of God. It was also the perspective of God. Y'all are tired of hearing me. So I'll try to do a little bit better here. Listen to the other words of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They said that God could save them. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to the king, you're not God, and neither are we. We don't understand everything that's going on, but we understand that we don't always get it. That God often has a different perspective. Do you remember when little Samuel was with Eli in the temple? You remember the story when God calls out to Samuel and he keeps running to Eli asking him, what are you saying? And finally Eli says, go back and say, I'm here, Lord, speak. Your servant is listening. It's a cute story until God speaks to Samuel. And Eli says to Samuel, what is it that God said? It was a message of condemnation of the house of Eli. And Eli says back to this little boy about the message, he is the Lord. Let him do what is right in his eyes. Even when it might seem like it's harmful to us. Like Eli, we must say, God is God and we are not. One of my favorite writers is Dr. Gerald May. Dr. May was a physician and also a Christian mystic. He wrote a book on God's grace in difficult times. And here's a line in his book. He says, I am no longer very good at telling the difference between what is good and what is bad in my life. And that's interesting. He said, I was diagnosed with cancer and I decided that was a very terrible thing. And yet, through this disease, I drew closer to God and to my family and friends. And I decided that was a good thing. He said they offered me chemotherapy and it offered me a cure. And I thought, that's a great thing. And I took the therapy and I fought the cancer. And it hurt my heart. And I thought that is a bad thing. And here I am sick again. And now I don't know. I don't really know what is good and what is bad. But then he says, but whatever it is all in God's grace. We think we know what we want in life so many times. But God often has a different perspective for us. God is looking in ways that we don't even know. Recently, I was over at Ben and Susan Wood's home, and if y'all know the Woods, you know that they're big NC State fans. And I picked up a book, and it was Wolfpack Devotionals, and I thought, what in the world? And I started reading it, and it's a book of stories about the Wolfpack, and it has stories that relate to how God might use our life too. And it talked about a 1987 basketball team. And if you're a Duke fan or a UNC fan, you won't like this story. You might remember back in 87 that NC State wasn't doing all that well. In fact, they were losing more than they were winning. Coach Valvano looked out at his team, and he had some really good players, but they weren't mixing well. So he changed the whole lineup. He gave his forwards a lot more playing time, and he said, we're going to change our strategy. And he put Quentin Jackson as his point guard, and he said, we've been trying to run, but we can't run with the rest of them, so we're going to slow it down. Slow it down. You see, he had been over on the sidelines while his players had been struggling, and he had been watching and seeing something different. The players had to trust him and begin to play a different game. That year, they went on to win the ACC tournament. They were difficult games, but they won because they trusted their coach, and they listened to somebody who had a different viewpoint and a different way of doing things. I often think of us as a church, as a team, and God is our coach. God looks down and sees us and has put us in a game of life. But God has a different perspective on things. God says, you might have to listen to me and do things differently. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego must have thought that God had deserted them when they were taken captive to Babylon. They didn't know exactly what to do, and yet they chose to trust God and to say, even if you kill us, we will still worship God. God has a different perspective on a lot of things. And one of the things is how we treat one another in life, how we look at each other. We look on the outside, but God looks deep within the heart of man. And God looks at us and looks for what is right in us. When we look at each other, what do we see? I must confess to you that sometimes the worst of my prejudices can come out. When we were down in Belize and we were doing God's work, we were doing construction and we were going out and visiting others, there was this older man that kept following us around. His name was Mateo. He was missing most of his teeth. He looked like that if the wind blew, he'd be blown away. He was hunched over, and I made some assumption about Mateo. I thought, well, this man is obviously uneducated. He's obviously very poor. I don't know what it is he has for us. He's just kind of following us around. And then when we were out delivering the mercy bags, which were staples of food and different things were taken to some poor families, there he was walking along with us. And we came to one house, and the woman greeted us, and she began to speak, and our interpreter, who spoke Spanish, looked at us, and he said, I can't interpret this. She's speaking Maya, which is an ancient Mayan language. Mateo stepped forward and said, I can speak Maya. and he interpreted for us. He also spoke perfect English and wonderful Spanish. This man, who I assumed knew little, was probably the smartest one standing there. And then I asked somebody about him, who is this fellow? And they said, oh, he is the one that God used to start this church. He is the one that believed and said, let's have a Bible study. Let's have a prayer meeting, and I'll open my house. And he is the one that began to gather people together in this village to pray. And the church formed in his home. He's the grandfather of the church. Oh, how wrong I was. How about you? When you look at others, do you see God's perspective, or do you just look through your own eyes? Aren't you glad that God looks at you differently? That God judges you differently? We need to learn to display the perspective of God, to look at others with loving eyes as God looks at us. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, God has all the power, King, but we'll tell you something else. We are in God's hands, and we trust God. That can be very, very difficult. Because Nebuchadnezzar said to those three young men, go in, trust your God. I'm going to throw you into the furnace, and we'll see what God can do then. And they bound them, and they went and they threw them in the furnace, and they made it so hot that the men that threw them in were killed. And something happened. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar looked down into that furnace. And picking up in verse 24, here's the story. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of the gods. Where was God? God was in the fire. God was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire, and not a hair was burned. But God did not show up until they went into the fire. We all want God to be with us, but God is often ahead of us. You say, yes, Pastor, but Scripture says, and lo, I will be with you always, even unto the end of the earth, right? Yes. God is with us always, but before that, Jesus says, go into all the earth and proclaim the gospel, and I will be with you. God is often out in front of us, calling us to the work of God. We are promised that God will be with us when we follow Christ to make disciples. A pastor friend of mine told me a story about his little girl. They were at church one evening, and he went into the sanctuary to get something, and churches at night can be a little creepy, by the way. If you've never been in a church at night, it's quiet and it's different. And they were in the sanctuary, and he had the lights on, and his little preschool girl was running up and down the aisles, and he called her. He said, Matilda, come on, it's time to go. And he went and stood by the door. She laughed and hid under a pew. She didn't want to go. She wanted to play. And he said, Matilda, come on, Daddy's leaving. And he heard her crawling around underneath him. He said, Matilda, this is the last time I'm calling you. It's time to go. Mommy's waiting. And she giggled and ran to the back corner. At which point, he just flipped off the lights. Then he heard little feet Pitter patter, scurrying up the aisle, and in the darkness, he felt something jump into his arms. And he embraced his little girl. And she said, Daddy, Daddy, I thought you were going to leave me. And he said, I'm never going to leave you. But sometimes you have to go with me. We have work to do. My friends, we ask sometimes in our great challenges of life, where is God? God is out in front of us, sometimes calling us to trust him in the fire. God is present with us, but we must be present with God.